Very good. Well, I would say if anything, we've got more people staying in this room than have left the room, so well done, gentlemen. Maybe it was the default of simply not having to stand up, but nonetheless, thank you for choosing this panel discussion. There's a wide variety of subjects that we'll address this afternoon. We have an hour now. We want to give a chance to hear from you guys as well, but I think we'll have fun. We'll get into it and see where we land. I had the pleasure of working alongside Chris Penk when I worked as an advisor in Parliament, and think that engagement from politicians, both at the local level and at the national level, is crucial for the defence of free speech. But it's not the silver bullet. In the same way, I work alongside a lot of lawyers kind of, to hammer everything as a nail. The solution to the problems that we have is we don't have enough law. I'm not sure that's quite correct. So I wonder, just to start off with, James, maybe we can start with you and hear from you in terms of what can local government officials and politicians, in your case, do to protect free speech, and what do you think is beyond your purview and are bigger issues than you're able to address?
We're quite lucky, I guess, in the local government sense, where we have regular meetings which are open to the public, and people can come in and say what they like. And I think it really is important that they can come in and say what they like. Really disappointing. I'm not sure how many people have been badly behaved enough to have to be forced to watch the council live streams. But there was an interesting course of events not that long ago with Park Terrace, for example, where council staff under a delegated authority removed one of the 2 lanes for the northbound traffic, replacing it with a cycleway. Anyway, yes, I've been very tempted to mow them down. Not the cyclists, the barriers that have been put there. But that, especially when you've got one of the widest grass verges in all of the city right beside it. But I digress. A resident who lived nearby there, who was aghast at what had happened, never had an opportunity to make their views known through a consultation process, and they came in and made a really well-informed, and I thought a fantastic deputation, possibly because I agreed with a lot of what she said. But even putting that to one side, probably about 5 or 6 councillors in the middle of the deputation stood up and walked out in the middle of it, and I thought that was just such a slap in the face to not only free speech but actually what democracy is about, and I think they're intrinsically connected. So. Examples like that, I think, is a really poor example of it. But people listening and respecting all people's views, just as I would sit there and listen to whatever someone said, irrespective of whether I agreed with it or not, that's their right, and I think they need to be afforded the decency to have that listened to and considered.
Equally, at the national level, what is inbounds for where we can turn to you to see leadership in the free speech space, and where should we not be turning to Parliament to see that leadership?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're at an interesting moment in time. When I accepted the invitation, I was the Shadow Attorney General. I still am, by the way, although if I do get a message during the course of the presentation that causes me to upgrade or downgrade my credentials in that regard, then I'll quickly change hats metaphorically. So in terms of legislation that you might expect coming up, I can't speak on behalf of the new government in that sense, but I suppose I can at very least reiterate the position of the National Party prior to the election in terms of specific legislative proposals that have been made by the then Labour government that would restrict free speech. So whether you want to dive into the proposed so-called hate speech law, of course, we can do that. But I think actually, just to echo the comments of my colleague and friend here, I think at the central government level, as with that local government, but also in civil society more generally, I think there are many things we can do in relation to free speech and encouraging it that are cultural in nature as opposed to legal or legislative. So we should take opportunities to speak freely, to exercise that right. Echoing your own words, Jonathan, we must use these rights if we're not to lose them, and to the lady's very articulate point before about the challenge for a younger generation, I think it might be difficult for younger New Zealanders to know that free speech is to be fought for if we're asking them to protect something that they have never enjoyed themselves or never exercised. So as parliamentarians, and it's not always easy, particularly in an MMP environment where one is bound by the dictates of party policy, more so than a constituency-based scenario, as for example in the UK, but nevertheless we can do that on our own behalves and on behalves of those who believe in free speech generally, but we should also take opportunities to stick up for the rights of others who are speaking in a way that represents them taking a risk, speaking up for the principles of free speech. You've rightly mentioned already and acknowledged Dr. David Cumin, sir, huge respect for your principled advocacy in terms of free speech, notwithstanding that you have a view which I also happen to share personally, but strongly in relation to the dangers of anti-Semitism. So that principled stance and that of others in this room who I could mention, I think is a key thing that we need to protect and exercise crucially moving forward.
I find it an interesting comment that you've raised there, James, in terms of the culture that some representatives now have towards ratepayers or to voters more generally and citizens in our nation. My wife is a local councillor and frequently hears from individuals she fundamentally disagrees with, but it is her role to represent those individuals and those views. Where, in your opinion, is this disdain emerging from that is quite condescending of the power structure that is theoretically supposed to exist? As you say, this is bigger than free speech. It strikes to the heart of whether we live in a democratic society where the will of the people takes its form in representatives. That's not something the Free Speech Union shies away from the slightest. That is entirely connected to our raison d'etre. What do you think is contributing to this?
That really is the million-dollar question, and I think it's one of the most damaging and worrying things, that as a society, that we're contending with. I don't know. I doubt that I'm alone in this, particularly given the results of the election. But I'm 38 years old now. I have a wife and 3 beautiful children, and for me, representing my community was a real privilege and a pleasure, but there was a whole other layer of importance given to it. I guess when I became a father and you look at things through a different lens, and certainly in my life, with obviously perhaps slightly more interested in politics than most, I'd never seen our country that I loved and was so proud of and wanted to add value to be in a position that I thought was quite frankly so dangerous. And a huge component of that was around what's happened with this cancel culture and free speech. It doesn't mean that people might say things that I agree with or disagree with. It doesn't really matter, but as the mantra goes, I will defend to the death your right to say it. And right now, it's just absolutely terrifying that when people that have got a platform disagree with what other people have said, they can bring them down and destroy careers and everything. It's very, very worrying. And the sad thing is, I don't see that there's any circuit breaker to that or an end in sight. So I think it's just incredibly important that people fight for that right to be able to say what they feel.
Do you get a sense that there is a bit of a backlash coming? Are we at or approaching an inflection point where people become aware of the stakes at play?
Yes, I think so, and I think that's happened on a number of levels. And you can see with what's happened with a number of Trump supporters and the like in the United States, that I think we are getting to that tipping point. In New Zealand, perhaps that hasn't occurred so radically, but I feel that it's very much there. The interesting thing, though, as well, and I think it has been, I think that at a more macro level, I think social media and the like, and people being quite ironically given this voice, has also then contributed to having these cliques which shame other people and give them a platform to try and shut other people down. And then on more of the micro level, I think that we've had a government that's waded into areas which they just had no business wading into, and have further exacerbated that. What the solution for that is, I don't know, but I sure as hell want to be a part of trying to be a part of that solution.
We've seen a mixed bag, as it were, across Parliament in terms of the real sense of a duty to represent communities and constituents, regardless of how offensive or outlandish their opinions may be. I would be remiss in a crowd such as this to not bring up, and you'll have to contend on this, Chris, the Parliament at protests. I can accept various points that as Lord Sumpton mentioned, every crowd, every mob, every protest, however we want to describe that, will have tag-alongs that are disgraceful. I don't think anyone can seriously describe the Parliament protest as it initially emerged, though, as the way it was described in the media. So how did the National Party and how did you, as a parliamentarian, come up with the decision over 3 weeks to refuse to engage with such a emotive and engaged expression of the people's will?
Yeah, well, great question, thank you. And some variation of that I've been asked by others and also challenged myself with, as you can imagine, over the period of the 3 weeks and, of course, the intervening time. I think it's interesting, and without sounding defensive, I think there's a different answer whether we make a decision over the period of 3 weeks as opposed to within that first 24-hour period. And the reason I make that distinction is because at the point that there was an illegal occupation with tents erected and so forth, then something did change. Now, if the argument, of course, would be that if members of Parliament had gone and met with the protesters initially, then the protesters wouldn't have felt compelled to set up an occupation that in turn was a breach of the rules. So, I accept there's an argument that was available both ways, but it was also the case, and we were talking about a balance of rights and allowing everyone to have a freedom of expression. That parliamentary law is actually quite often the subject of petitions being presented or demonstrations or protests or whatever. And so the fact that there was an ongoing protest on one particular issue, and dare I say it, one particular side of that issue, did in turn restrict the free speech rights of others to then go ahead and use that property in that way. So I would argue it was a bit more nuanced than merely whether one agreed with the protesters and were prepared to go out there. Personally, I had friends, people I'd served with in the military who had lost their jobs in the military. I was in contact with them throughout and advocating for them at one point as the National Party spokesperson for defence and wanting to support in all the ways that I was able to, but at the same time conscious of the point that you made earlier, which is to say, and actually Lord Sumption himself made the point that in a sufficiently large-scale protest or gathering even, there will always be one or two outliers who probably don't represent the views or the overall impetus of the protest. Now that's a problem, because if we say, well, if 99% of the people there were perfectly reasonable or even unreasonable, but expressing the way in a non-violent, non-offensive fashion, then why shouldn't they be heard? But the political reality that we live in, including the media landscape, but also more generally in our culture, is that if the 1% are associated with those with the other 99%, then by meeting one, you're meeting with them all. You're being tainted. There was, for example, a swastika that was spray painted on one of those monuments, and if you can imagine a photograph with one of us with that in the background and the way that would have been portrayed in the media. Now, I appreciate you're probably thinking that actually that in itself would have been a misrepresentation. I understand that that swastika was an expression of contempt for the government acting in a totalitarian fashion. So they were saying that the government was acting in a way that was totalitarian, rather than saying that there was some sort of anti-Semitic or otherwise fascist feeling among those who are attending. But nevertheless, you've got to understand that it's not easy to make a decision when there can so easily be a misconstruction, or portrayal of an event as compared with the feelings and motivations of those on the ground and the feelings and motivations of those who would love to go down and have a conversation if it were possible to do that without being, as I say, portrayed in some other way.
Is there not a duty on leaders to damn the consequences to an extent when we see such a unprecedented expression of the public will? I accept all those points. Of course, they are entirely correct. And yet, Lord Sumption on his Q&A interview at the beginning of this week said that it's too much to expect politicians to possibly admit that they might have gotten it wrong. And I say rubbish. Leadership allows us to say we made a decision at the time, and this is much bigger than you personally, of course, or even the National Party, but leadership says, you know what, we got it wrong, and maybe a political culture that allows us to say we got it wrong is something that we need to spearhead.
Yeah, I think it's a very well made point. I think if members of all political parties, including my own, had gone out and met with the protesters on that first day, then I think we'd be having a very different conversation. So to the extent that that represents an acknowledgement that things could or should have been done differently, then happy to give that. But I also think, at the risk of pushing back ever so gently, because I know we're among friends.
We're not here just to fluff each other up. Let's have a good Barney.
Absolutely. Well, far be it from me to self-censor at a gathering of the Free Speech Union. But, I think in many ways we have the media and the political class that we deserve overall as a citizenry. There have been a number of times when politicians have stood up valiantly for views that might be unpopular or controversial, and they've received very little support from members of the public. And honourable exceptions, I'm conscious I'm in the presence of those who, by definition, being in attendance at the Free Speech Union and being members and fellow members at that and supporters, you're the honourable exception to the rule. But the reality is, in the media landscape, if unpopular opinions are not supported, and if people simply sat by the same papers as those who censor opinions, and we might scoff at that, and we might spit out our flat white as we're reading letters to the editor and realise that there's been this degree of censorship. But if we're supporting that and we're not supporting the alternative voices, then what should we expect except more of the same? The same goes for politicians. In that sense, and I realise this is ever so slightly arguing against myself here as one who is an incumbent politician, but you get what you deserve in that respect as a democracy. If that's to be the rule of the people, which of course democracy is etymologically as well as in spirit, then simply we've got to stand up and we've got to defend it. We've got to defend those who defend those rights too.
Can I add from here that your leader did empathise with the crowd in that very clear stage, was taken down by Jacinda in Parliament, but never stood back up again. And I think going back to what Lord Sumpter said before, Jacinda's used and the media used, there was good intent by your leader on day one, but that just evaporated. He wouldn't come out and do it again.
Yeah.
No one came out after that. Jacinda took it down, and that's where to me, that's where the issue is. As soon as Jacinda took that down to Parliament, we have a person on the other side who's empathising with that river of filth down there. That's where it started, or that's where it finished.
Can I, with the indulgence of the chair, can I just respond to that? And I'll say, I take your point, but I also remember there was a guy who stood up against and spoke out against some of the measures that were being taken by the then government in relation to COVID-19, and we're here obviously not to litigate the specifics of that, but when Simon Bridges said, exercising his right of free speech, indeed on behalf of some New Zealanders, albeit not all, that he believed that the lockdowns were proceeding for too long a period of time because the government wasn't sufficiently organised. The disapproval from the New Zealanders who overall were able to determine his fate as the leader of the opposition, he was out in his ear. Overall, the people in the democracy were overwhelmingly opposed to the things he was saying. I personally thought at the time he was right, and you might say that, well, of course you would, Chris, because you were, a loyal member of His Majesty's opposition. Her Majesty's then, of course, but history will record that the people didn't like that and disagreed. So, we've sort of, obviously we have to stand up for minority views, but you've also got to understand that a democracy, by definition, or at least in the way that we exercise it, being majoritarian rule, more or less in this country, notwithstanding the plurality of voices, will lead to these outcomes where we simply don't like actions taken. And if 51% of the population agree with the course of action or the things being said, in this instance by Simon Bridges, but keep quiet about it, then more for them, because of course the other side will look, albeit a vocal minority, will look like the majority.
You're stealing all my best material. Do either of you have a comment on that, James?
I don't want to monopolise, so... Oh, yeah, look, I think it's a very fair question. We have to ask about the role of the Fourth Estate and its closeness to government. If the media is one of the key forms of accountability in our modern civil society, and if it's to be the media in that genuine, pure sense, as in being between the decision makers and the people, then To the extent that the media ends up close to the politicians, and if there's a relationship of funding that underscores that, then I think rightly people are going to say, well, there's a conflict of interest, or at the very least a perceived conflict of interest. So I think you asked the right question. I don't know exactly the extent to which funding arrangements motivated particular aspects of news coverage, but these are subjects on which we should challenge ourselves.
I'm also saying that I don't believe that we really understood what political was in that.
Yeah, well, that's fair. And in the social media realm, certainly I know I made a couple of comments that were effectively disagreeing with very particular restrictions. I thought I was making quite reasonable points about, for example, supermarkets, butchers and greengrocers being able to be open as opposed to supermarkets. And again, we're having a discussion specifically about public health. Like everyone else, I became a qualified epidemiologist in that time. But by way of example, that was something I could speak as local MP, and I got absolutely slammed for it. People didn't like that. And maybe that was the social media algorithm, or maybe it was the fear of the people speaking as opposed to what they would have thought and expressed had they not been fearful. Or maybe they were self-censoring because, of course, there's the pile-on of other social media users. So I'm not unfamiliar with these points, but suffice to say, again, we see what we see and we get what we deserve in that regard, and we have to ask hard questions of the government of the day. And it's easy for me to sit here and say that now because I was in opposition. And I very much hope that the Free Speech Union, and I know you will, and all of you individually will challenge the incoming government on these points as well, again, in terms of cosiness and relationship with the media.
I think it's a very good point. I just can't add too much more on that, other than the fact that it's certainly not a good look. And I totally agree that I didn't believe that the mainstream media was necessarily portraying the majority of people's views. So in total agreement, and it's a point well made.
We will come to questions before long. We have another good half hour, so we will come to you. Don't worry, James. To come back to you though. Of course, in Christchurch, you have Chris Lynch's media, and in general, the mainland has a different feel to it than the North Island, especially those of us who are condemned to spending an unhealthy amount of time in Wellington. Do you think that the cultural context and the way, we think of social media across the country and indeed around the world, but do you think we're facing these issues differently in different parts of the country? Do you get a different sense of what is going on in Christchurch and in the South Island that might differ from my experience in Wellington or Chris's experience in Auckland?
Very much so. Look, I think it's most certainly nuanced in the different areas. And, quite obviously I'm in the Christchurch bubble there, live and breathe the likes of, the press and all the local media. But this has changed, in my opinion, certainly in my time as a city councillor. I was first elected in 2010, not long prior to the Canterbury earthquakes, and the amount of change, obviously the physical landscape, but certainly in the media as well. Even looking at the likes of the press nowadays, which was, I guess, seen in some ways as the source of all truth, it is very different now. It's a paid subscription type service. So I don't believe that, and the subscriptions have been dropping tremendously then. So people were very fixated on what the media did. And I think people are far less concerned about the press nowadays. The coverage really hasn't been what it used to. This is not Christchurch-centric, but they have been victims of what's happened in print media all over the world, where when I first started, loath to say back in my day, but it was... Can
I just clarify, were you old enough to vote for yourself when you first ran for council?
Barely. Yes, I was 25 when I was first elected as a city councillor. But back then, there was, we had a number of press reporters that would attend every single every single council meeting. Then everything was published in real time online with comments and Facebook and all these forms of engagement. Nowadays, I don't even subscribe to the press because I'm a bit cheap, so I just read the first couple of lines, and then if no one's rung me about it, I assume it was fine. But there's no comments anymore. That's all been disabled. They disabled all of their social media accounts, so there's none of that there. There's very little which is actually of real quality.
Of course, there is the claim, and Carl Dufresne and Annie in the journalist panel might comment on this shortly, but that, Sinead Boucher, who bought Stuff, which owns the Post and the Press, paid $1 for stuff, and they claim she overpaid. There is the question as to whether we are in this state because we became too comment-driven, too clickbait-driven, all of these open articles that anyone could read but no one was paying for. Chris, I don't know, do you have an opinion in terms of a free speech argument for actually publicly funded journalism? I know that the PJIF, the Public Interest Journalism Fund, was notoriously unpopular amongst those that might be supporters of the Free Speech Union. I think that's unfair. I think there's an argument to be made that there should be government funding for good journalism as long as appropriate editorial guidelines exist. Well, no, I don't accept that is totally subjective. There's lots of countries in the world that have good, impartial editorialising. Mike Grimshaw supports me. That's good enough for me. Chris, do you have a point?
Well, I think at the very least, if you do have public funding of journalism, and critics would say that public interest journalism was somewhat Orwellian in nature because, of course, the interest of the public, but determined by some others, might be sort of oxymoronic in itself. But I think at the very least you can't put conditions on what that is, either explicit or implicit in terms of what would be acceptable journalism.
And by that you mean political operators can't put those conditions?
Yeah, well, yes, in political or even on a policy basis. So we don't need to allege in any kind of way that there would be inappropriate direction from a party political or a partisan perspective, but even a worldview whereby we can say, whereby it was said, in fact, that certain subjects were off limits, but nevertheless the taxpayer would need to be funding that. And I think that's one of the arguments as well against public funding of political parties in terms of campaigns, as opposed to members of parliament and ministers doing their job. And of course that's a theoretical distinction at times, but at least in principle, we shouldn't be having people funding points of view that they don't agree with, unless equally there could be their side of the story put forward, because I think otherwise we've got the worst of both worlds. You can make an argument on an almost libertarian basis that nothing should be funded, or you can be a bit more state-centric and say, well, of course, you can make good arguments for engagement, but you can't have it both ways, and you can't sort of look to skew the debate in that kind of way.
James, tell me, are gangs a big issue in Christchurch?
Well, gangs are a big issue everywhere. Crime is a big issue in Christchurch, so I guess inherently then gangs are. Certainly over what exactly those reasons are, I can't say. Certainly with all of the factors, with cost of living crisis and everything like this, and then, a judicial system and police, system which is not where it was, coupled with health and everything like this, it's a really challenging environment. People have been doing it tough on a number of levels. And then, when there's no consequences to things, I guess then that doesn't send a particularly good message. It was only, probably I was at a meeting about a week ago, and I was talking with another director there, and he was saying that they watched their family car get broken into outside the window, and they actually had a tracking device or a GPS thing, like a Find My iPhone type tag with the car. So they did a bit of a stakeout and followed the car to a street in Christchurch, and they rang the police. And at the time when it was happening, they said, look, we're very busy right now, but we can't come out. So they followed it to where it was, at what looked to be a gang house, and they phoned the police there and said, we're actually sitting outside, and we're looking at our stolen car, and they said, just lodge the insurance claim, where it's... And I think you have all these factors then that compile to create, just a culture which doesn't seem to be getting any of this under control. So in terms of, visible gang patches and gang fights, no, I don't see that day to day, but I think with where crime has gone and everything like that, it would be naive and probably completely incorrect of me to say that it's not a problem, because it must be connected.
So the issue is our stolen cars and violence in our streets, more so than intimidation and harassment.
No, I don't think it's isolated to any one thing, and I don't think that I'm qualified to be able to say that it's one thing in particular, but certainly the feedback from residents, and even just from being a Christchurch citizen myself, when I walk around with my family in town, we connoisseurs of playgrounds nowadays, and spend our weekends trying to tire them out so we can enjoy some Uber Eats in the evening. But if we can do that task appropriately, then it's a successful weekend. But I find that so often we find ourselves actually steering away from parts of town where there are, whether it's homeless people or gangs, not necessarily doing anything illegal, but it's not a particularly savoury environment that you want to bring your young family around, and that is far worse than what I've ever seen it as. And I wish I had a silver bullet or I could say what it is, but I think realistically it's just a combination of factors.
The knowing chuckles of young parents in the room. Chris, will you commit to issuing an Issue 7 report if you are Attorney General, condemning Mark Mitchell's proposed legislation to outlaw gang patches, because it does objectively infringe on the basic human rights the basic human rights of citizens of New Zealand? Okay, let's do that. Let's hear the question around.
Let's wait to see whose side he's on first before we agree. Can I just say, as the Shadow Attorney General and still not the Attorney General, I might or might not, just checking in case any status has changed recently, missed call, Christopher Luxon. I think, so you refer to Section 7 report, so for those who are uninitiated, under the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, the Attorney-General has the important role of reporting to Parliament whether proposed legislation is consistent or inconsistent with the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. So, of course, you refer to the idea that gang patches or insignia would be banned from all public places. And, of course, as a starting point, Section 14 of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act is about freedom of expression, the ability to part and receive and display opinions and so forth. And so immediately that right is limited. So yes, I think for whoever the next Governor-General is, clearly... Attorney General, excuse me. Getting ahead of myself.
That comes later in your career.
Speaking of totalitarian regimes, I've promoted myself within the executive. So for that, whoever that person is, they will need to draw to attention to the Parliament that is a breach, or rather a limit on the right of freedom of expression. However, in Section 5 of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, of course, it explicitly says that rights are to be balanced against each other and against responsibilities too, for that matter, such that if the limit can be justified in a free democratic society, then it's said to be justified. So that opinion, whoever is to deliver it, would need to note, for a start, the policy objective, and we've heard from our friend in local government, at the local level there are many very serious issues, and so we say, well then, is it a proportionate limit on the right? And we say, in that case, for example, while instinctively I personally am on the side of freedom of expression, including for those with whom I disagree, you could say in relation to gang patches, to the extent that those represent a person having conducted a violent criminal offence to have gained that, then that in itself is an incitement to violence. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if we're balancing rights and we've got freedom of association and freedom of assembly, sections 17 and 16, New Zealand Bill of Rights Act respectively, then if the rights of others, such as my playground frequenting friend here,
on his children's behalf, we should probably note.
I should have clarified that. That made it sound way less savoury than it actually is. I also visit a lot of playgrounds and schools, but for also wholesome reasons of being a father of young ones. So just to take it off, just whatever.
Moving on, okay.
Never alone, just to clarify.
The legal panel's upstairs. I'm sure I could get some free advice to stop talking now. Anyway, so to the extent that others' rights are impinged, albeit by the limit of that freedom of expression in terms of gang members wearing those patches, to the extent that that would intimidate others and prevent them exercising or want to exercise their freedom of assembly and association and movement, then that's a real weighing exercise. So that'll be a tough one.
And Chris, you know I hold the utmost respect and affection for you, but bullshit.
But
Lord Sumpton endorsed the position of the Free Speech Union that anti-Semites should be allowed to burn the Israeli flag as they chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And the good doctor finds it in himself to defend that, because I have no interest in defending gang members, but if I can know who they are, at least then I won't frequent playgrounds where their children, isn't it quite a superficial analysis to say that once we get rid of gang patches, we're in any regard safer whatsoever? Are we not arguably less safe?
Oh, well, you can make an argument on a practical basis that it would be better to know who these people are.
But the essence of censorship, the argument for free speech is that censorship doesn't work. You can push it underground, but it doesn't deal with the issue at all. And if the issue here are criminal personalities that find themselves so disenfranchised from society that they are willing to frequently release themselves from the social contract, why would we not want to know who these people are?
Well, I mean, you're saying, talking as though the only reason that one would ban gang patches is recruitment. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's a reasonable discussion to have if you're making that weighing exercise.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I understand, and James, jump in here when you want, but I understand that there are probably two core arguments, recruitment and intimidation. And I could very easily see, and this is the principled hard work of free speech advocacy. We have to imagine what our enemies would do with this power, and I can very easily imagine a future government saying that the shirt that says TERF on it is intimidatory and harassment and should no longer be allowed, that those damn TERFs are so disenfranchised and disconnected from society, they shouldn't be allowed to express themselves. Are we not setting a horrific precedent with this law?
I think I understand where you're coming from a principled basis, and as I say at that level, I don't disagree. However, I think there's a worthwhile distinction in relation to the gender-critical debate, which, for shorthand, TERF, trans-exclusionary radical feminists.
Doesn't it roll off the tongue?
Doesn't it? Yeah, so TERF... yeah, I've never just seen that word by itself, and it's unusual. Yeah, that's right. Well, indeed. Right, well, there we go. See, that's interesting, actually, and the reason I was going to draw that distinction with the situation of gang members, because I'm pushing back, at least a little on this, is that the idea that people have a different view about, how many sexes there are in the relationship between sex and gender, people might say they disagree with that and it makes them feel unsafe. If that's not physically unsafe, but people feel physically unsafe, and reasonably so, in relation to gang members who are conducting physical, actual violent crimes that are proscribed by the Crimes Act, then that is a fair distinction, I think, for those who believe in free speech, but not to the absolutist extent that we would do away with incitement to violence as a basis. And I think it's probably common ground in this room, and again, to appeal to authority, certainly, Lord Sumption in his remarks earlier would, I think, made it clear that he, as well as, the jurisdictions of the UK and New Zealand currently, rightly defer to, incitement to violence as a distinction to merely feeling unsafe because my feelings are hurt and I happen to disagree, and I don't think you should be able to express that in a restaurant or, heaven forbid, on Twitter. Okay, so broken mast?
No.
Oh, pro-Hamas, I beg your pardon.
The Broken Mast group.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a very good question. So if you're talking about a group that is pro-Hamas, I think that becomes then a factual question. If wearing that would incite people to go and do violence against Jewish people in New Zealand, then actually I would say that would be incitement to violence, because that's literally the definition. If, however, there's some geopolitical stance that I might personally disagree with, but is nevertheless expression of someone's views about how the United Nations should deal with the question of Middle East politics, then I think that's different. Well, if you... My starting point, and I didn't... Well, yeah, well, that's an interesting point in itself in terms of criminal organisations and who gets to define that. Yeah, well...
the military wing of it, at least.
Rightly or not, Hamas, the so-called military wing of it is designated as such, but the rest is not. So that's kind of a complex basis in itself, regardless of, again, whether we think that it should be. I think the basis of my argument before in terms of incitement to violence, and I apologise that I didn't spell this out more clearly, is my understanding is that at least for some of these criminal gangs, that the way you earn a patch and those stripes and those insignia is by committing a violent act against other people. So if that's the case, then we are saying to people, by allowing you to wear that in public, and to advertise your status in that regard, you have effectively encouraged people to have done that act, to have that in the first place. Now, I accept that's a nuanced argument. I also accept you might not agree with it, but that's...
True, because it used to be true.
It used to be true, but it's not now. Okay.
Not as much.
Oh, not as much. Okay. Well, there might be some nuance there, and
No, sorry, you can earn a patch through, sorry, a criminal defence with. You can earn a patch through violent activity, but there's other ways of doing it.
right. Okay. Can I throw you a bone and say, actually, I think probably the more problematic aspect would be if there are tattoos or expressions of membership that aren't easily discarded, and I mean literally, a jacket or some other clothing that can be taken off, because then the legal difficulty that my friend here and others will have identified in relation to those is the question of retrospectivity, because if you have gang insignia or other, let's just say for shorthand, offensive insignia tattooed at a time when having those displayed in public wasn't a matter of criminal wrongdoing, but it now is, then we've got the principle that we don't make retrospective laws against someone's interest. So that'll be an interesting one again for the next Attorney General. And by the way, the further this conversation goes on, the more I hope it's not me.
I want to come back to you in just 1 second, James, but Chris, briefly, what do you think the strongest argument the Free Speech Union could bring against Mark Mitchell would be in terms of opposing a law that outlaws gang patches?
Hypothetically, if I wasn't responsible for caucus discipline also as the senior whip of the National Party, I would advise myself that we should be... or that one should be brave and take as close as possible to an absolutist argument in favour of free speech. By the way, I'm now wondering have I interpreted your question the right way around?
I don't think you did, but that's a very interesting comment nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I should say is that there are reasonable arguments to be made on both sides, and I hope that the discussion is sufficiently balanced to identify measures that can be taken to curb and deal with the very real problem of gang violence and intimidation and so forth in New Zealand that don't unduly impinge on the rights and freedoms of people, even as we might regard them or certainly their actions as despicable and indeed dangerous.
I was on an interview with Michael Laws the other day, who holds a very strong opinion in this regard, and was in fact the mayor in Wanganui in 2010 and 11 when a bylaw was passed to the same effect as the proposed policy. And I said, Michael, right now in Hawke's Bay, gang members don't wear patches. They simply wear colours because gang harm is so prolific and gang membership is so prolific in that community that you don't have to have a mongrel mob patch on. You simply wear a colour. And he said, well, outlaw banning wearing that colour.
Can I just say, all I should say to that is I'm not wearing a rosette with a big N on it, but I am wearing a blue tie, so heaven forbid that we should get into a situation where we're banning colours on the spectrum.
Is the policy workable then? I mean, if it's not a mongrel mob patch, it'll be a ring. If it's not a ring, it'll be an earring. If it's not that, it'll be a colour. It'll be a muku that has a symbol in it, that it's then a muku, and it's not actually a facial tattoo. To what extent will we pursue this? The intricacies. Yeah,
I mean, you're asking very practical questions about how you draft or enforce, and I think those are very good questions. In terms of how such a law would need to be put together, it would be very difficult. I don't disagree with that.
James, you were 25 when you were first elected to local council, and what consistently occurs to me in the many discussions that we have in this space is that the fundamental absence of courage from our political discourse and from much of our political leadership is what is poisoning the well of democracy in this country. To stand up at 25 and put yourself forward for the second largest city in the country as a councillor is a courageous thing to do. I have no doubt your family has paid a price for that, and likewise, of course, at a national level, to put yourself forward in these political positions takes courage. As two men who have exhibited this courage, how do we foster that more so that we actually have people that are standing up to engage in this?
It's a very good question. Remember, though, now this is my 5th term, so I'm the grumpy old man now of the council. It's very hard. I think that people ultimately, need to. I think everyone wants to feel valued in whatever they do. They want to be able to add value, and you want to be able to get on and do that job and have the tools there to do it. I still enjoy the job very much so, but I've also realised, like I said, I had far more layers, I think, to me in my role as an elected representative when I became a dad, and thought there were so many more important things to what I was doing. Yet in saying that as well, I also realised that sometimes what I got so wound up about doesn't really matter that much at all, because at the end of the day, all I want to be is a great husband and a great dad, and all those other things, they'll have their time and their place. But it's helped me put things into perspective very much. I think, this is the right forum to have this conversation, actually, really, because, I think people need to be enabled and given the confidence to be able to stand up for what they believe in. And I think, in some ways, it was a combination of idealism and naivety at a younger age there, where I was very comfortable in my role in the private sector and loved it, and frustrations that I had with the council got me to be in a space where I thought, you know what, I would consider it a privilege and a pleasure to be able to serve my community, but tell you what, I'll go along there and I'll give answers to questions that I believe in. If people agree with me, that's great, they should back me. If they don't, well, don't, because I don't deserve to be there. But I was paid reasonably well, I had a good work-life balance, and quite frankly, I felt if I was elected, it would be the sort of thing that I would have done for free anyway. So I felt that I did it for the right reasons, and the sad thing is, I've possibly felt a little bit saddened by people that I think have done it for the wrong reasons. Certainly in more recent times as well, I think that there are a lot more, or I've seen more single issue or very narrow ideologically fueled people being driven to these sorts of things. And, politics, whether it's central government, local level, they're very broad. There's a wide range of spectrums, and nothing is that simple. So, I think people having the confidence to stand up for what they believe in, to enjoy what they do, to have a sense of pride in their community, all of that's important, and a sense of duty and desire to serve. But I think people need to remain open-minded and have a broad open mind to a whole range of issues, because as I said, I think there's a lot of these. I don't want to say ideological nutters, but it's a bit late now. But there are some people that are just fueled by such narrow areas that I think it's just so dangerous, and then that really does light a fire under a very vocal minority, which loses all perspective of things, and that's something that I think is an unpleasant place to be sometimes, or I find in the role today.
How do we inculcate courage as a value to stand up for these basic freedoms, because we're losing so much ground as a result of passivity and cowardice?
Well, again, I think we need to support those who exhibit the courage, and sometimes it will be people we disagree with, and sometimes it will be people we agree with, and it's easier to remain silent in the face of the baying mob. Certainly I've, in a couple of conscience matters that have come before the New Zealand Parliament in my time, I've been much more outspoken than I have on matters of party policy, because I have to recognise those boundaries, but I've certainly received a lot of angry commentary and oftentimes, invariably from people who disagree with me, and there have been fewer voices of those who you would expect to speak in agreement at those moments. And it's not lost on me the irony that you have rightly celebrated my now former colleague and very dear friend Simon O'Connor, in the wake of an election in which he was the only National Party member to have lost his seat. And he spoke up, and by the way, very diligent, wonderful local MP for the electorate of Tamaki. And so I would say, and of course I'm biased because, again, I disclose if it wasn't obvious that I'm his friend as well as his party colleague, I think were it not for the portrayal of issues that he on which he made a courageous stand exercising his free speech, I think he would still be the Member of Parliament for Tamaki. And by the way, then, if we're talking about the balances and the trade-offs that one makes in the political space, he would then have the platform of being in Parliament to continue to advocate for those issues. And I'm not saying, of course, for a second that being an MP is the only way in which one can express an opinion, but if that is a valid way or a way in which he had wanted to continue to do that, he's no longer able to, specifically because he exercised his free speech and didn't receive sufficient support for doing so, then I think that's ask questions of all of us, including me, about the extent to which we support that right. And if we're not prepared to support those who are exercising it, then I don't know if we can say that we really are in favour of or zealous defenders of it. Now, again, just to be clear, in present company excluded, because you're here precisely because you believe these things in principle.
Most of them paid $50 to be here today. So
yeah, right.
These are the sell-out hardcore group.
Well, good on you, and thank you for that, for today, and for your ongoing advocacy through this great organisation, to you personally, Jonathan. But I think more generally in society, we've got a question to ask: do we value it or not? And if we don't value the people who are doing it, then I'm afraid the answer would appear to be no. So that's our challenge.
James, we'll go to the floor shortly, but I wanted to raise one last question with you in terms of a case we've recently taken to the Human Rights Review Tribunal. We've taken Taupo Council to the Human Rights Review Tribunal for what we allege is collusion between the council, a security company, and a local activist group in order to create a justification for the exclusion of Julian Batchelor from using those premises. Access to public venues is one of the issues that the Free Speech Union has worked out across considerably, and most of you, or some of you, may have seen that we've recently released legislation which the National Party has endorsed, along with the ACT Party and New Zealand First Party, that would put a positive duty on public venues, principally held by councils, but also universities, to enable the facilitation of free speech. There are more cases than we will be able to fight in a decade, just on Julian Batchelor alone around the country, because he faced so many cancellations. And again, I haven't hidden the fact that Julian Batchelor is not a person I'm personally inclined towards defending. I think if this is the extent of the commentary that we're going to have on important issues, we are poorer for it. But he should have the right to make his claims. At the council level in Christchurch, did you talk about Julian Batchelor specifically, or more generally, what's your perspective on how councils should facilitate engagement on complex issues in these local areas?
Yeah, look, this will come as no surprise, given that I eagerly jumped to come along here because, I agree and really, admire this organisation. So my default setting is open it up. This is the place for it. This is where you should have public debates, and it's absolutely terrifying, I think, what you've seen both locally, nationally, and also internationally around a whole range of venues, university campuses and the like, where people with different views, just haven't been welcomed and been driven away. So I think that, local councils have a responsibility, if they're going to be inclusive and believe in, equity and equality, then actually embracing different views and creating a safe forum for people to be able to share them in that sort of environment. I think there's an obligation on councils to do that, so I'd be very supportive of that. No, we didn't talk about that case that you were speaking of, and one thing that I actually find quite surprising, given that we've dealt with, we tend to deal with quite controversial things any given week, but in my time with Christchurch City Council, that hasn't been one thing that has touched wood. It will probably be next week now, having now said that, but it hasn't been something that has arrived at our table. In terms of the delegations, facilities and who's allowed there is an operational matter which is left for staff, and it's not brought necessarily in a paper to the council. However, if they got it horribly wrong, I would imagine that might change things. But touch wood, so far it hasn't, though by all intents and purposes, I think, encouraging the freedom of speech and people to come to these public venues, that's the place for it.
And to the credit of Ototahi Venues, which is owned by the council, when Jordan Peterson came here last year, there were considerable calls to have the venue shut off from, and essentially they told people to jog on. So good on them. That's the exact sort of response we need from them. Yeah. Look, I promised we'd go to the floor. We've got another 10 minutes and probably more time and more questions than we have time to. We've already heard from you and you, so let's jump to you. Just to know, we did have...
You've assumed my gender there.
Yep. Casey Costello and Nicole McKee were both rostered onto this, and because of the announcements yesterday, had to excuse themselves. So we did have 2 wahine Māori here as well, but your point stands.
But the other aspect of that is the fact that women cannot trust local and the national level to be advocated for. We're in a position now where we have to set up our own party, and that means conversely that there is no media coverage. It's seen as a urgent issue, and very often are not invited to things like the meet the candidates.
Is this a question for Chris or James?
Yeah, you're talking about democracy, but then, and saying that we have democracy, but then you have small parties that are not getting a fair opportunity. So how do you think we can address that?
You've identified a very real problem of incumbency bias for those who are not part of the political system, by which I mean not only running for Parliament and having the resources and the attention of being taken seriously as an existing party, or for those who are marginalised in the public square more generally, then of course it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because those who are on the outside can't get in for those reasons. So I don't know what the answer is exactly, but I know that keeping people from being able to assemble in publicly funded places, be it council buildings or universities, simply isn't the answer. If anything, of course, it takes us backwards. So I think that would be a good place to start. But I would also respectfully encourage you to continue to lobby existing institutions and political parties, in addition to setting up and running your own, because I think by maximising your ability to get results, you sort of have to work within the rules of the current system, as well as also trying to disrupt it from the inside once you can get there.
Adam.
Thank you. I'm very glad that Chris has been especially grilled on the gang patch issue, because my question is for the Chief Executive of the Free Speech Union. With regards to comments about public interest journalism funding, how can you possibly objectively measure media impartiality for the provision, like the causes to the provision of funding, and doesn't the very issue create at least a subconscious bias for media actors to support politicians who support public interest journalism funding against those who don't?
Sorry, I didn't hear that question. No, it's a fair point, and certainly, again, the Free Speech Union does not have a position on the fact that the government should fund media. I think the question was the comment that I made, that it is possible that publicly funded media is needed in a media ecosystem to provide some sort of quality content that isn't just salacious or clickbait. This is a really serious issue. The way democracies curate their media environment is directly connected to the stability of their government structure. And so we see in many Western and especially Anglophonic Western nations today, their media environment is directly causing much of the polarization and instability in their nation. So that is the problem. That's the easy part to state. That's something we all agree on. The solution to that is far more complex. I am thankful for outlets like The Platform. I'm thankful for outlets like Chris Lynch Media. I don't think a political and ideological outlet on one side is going to be countered by an ideological outlet on another. What we need is a media environment that believes truly in impartiality, and you can't impose that by government. The law does not have the capacity to require that. I do think, though, that there are models in Scandinavian nations in particular that do point us towards what that impartiality might look like. Professor Mike Grimshaw might know more about those specifically than I do. I'm simply aware that commentators and experts that I have some respect for have time for them, and that's enough for me as an outset. Mike, do you want to add anything to that?
Widely on that, I think there's teaching in the university over the last 25 years, what I've noticed is a rapid decrease in engagement and understanding of civic society, but a lack of understanding about civics, about the political process itself, either at local government games where people don't even know what local government does, or in central government. I wonder if it's time to actually introduce civics into our school education. When I talk to my students, they actually say themselves they need to have some understanding because there's no common discourse anywhere. if you ask them what they share in common, it's completely fragmented. What you need is some form of basic civics so they understand, well, what is democracy? How does government work? Even how does our political system work? Because we assume that there is a knowledge that we don't see. And I'm seeing the people who are succeeding in this school system, and that scares me, when the ones who are succeeding don't understand and they're not engaged themselves. And I think if we want to have democracy's got to be a project we've got to work on, and it might be actually time to introduce that, as well as that notion of a media that is actually engaged and communicating in a way that builds people together rather than the fragmentation that we see.
And yeah, bravo. Of course, for that very reason, the Free Speech Union can only do what we can do. But that's why we will be in 2 dozen schools this coming year, starting our work in that space, because the long walk through the institutions that has taken the past 30 years to accomplish can only be reversed if we turn around and we start walking back in the opposite direction. And it will take 30 years. We need to start with young people, and we will. But in 10 years, the Free Speech Union has the ambition of young professionals who in high school were educated and met with the claims of free speech, and who have been impacted through university and into their professional lives as a result of that. I think there is no alternative.
All 16-year-olds know how to vote for local elections.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to that. I think that was a very good point, incredibly well made. And I think, educating people on civics, it is absolutely core critical. And I think I'm glad that there was a comment made in jest as well, but very true too, that I don't think the way about necessarily addressing this or writing this is by bringing the voting age down, by lowering the voting age. There are a lot of people, and I'm staggered by this, the amount of people that I talk to who I would consider highly successful, intelligent, sophisticated people that have very little understanding around local democracy, particularly at the local level. People that surprise me, that constantly, where I think that they would have a better understanding of that. So I don't think that having more people with an even worse understanding of that is going to be the answer to it. But the civics education and informing people about it so they have the tools to be able to make informed decisions, I think, is the answer. And it's quite woeful that this isn't taught. But it's not just limited to civics training in terms of education, setting young people up to be able to contribute to society.
We're going to do one last question from Annie with the proviso that we've got 45 seconds and then you're stopping them from afternoon tea, so that's on you.
Okay, quickly, Chris. You spoke about conscience votes. They don't happen often, as the Chief whip. That often it's just a block party vote. Is our system fundamentally not set up for free speech because our MPs are basically hemmed in, made to vote exactly the same as everyone else in the country?
For anyone who didn't catch the essence of the question, if I can risk mischaracterising it, the challenge was, or the question was, do we have a system that's set up for free speech given the primacy of party votes and the fact that conscience votes are so rare? I think it's a fair challenge, but I also think the counter-argument is that if we all 120 or so MPs now just turn up and vote however we think on a particular issue, then there'll be very little certainty for the voters who elect them in the first place. For example, it's shorthand for me as the National Party candidate for Kaipara Mahurangi, which is the seat in which I have recently stood, formerly Helensville. They know that I will reliably vote in favour of certain things and against certain things. For example, actually, I think our position on hate speech laws, which I presume people in this room would largely agree with, you've got the certainty of knowing, because there's a party platform, I'm going to be disciplined enough to actually go ahead and do that. So I think, if anything, we could have maybe more issues on which we exercise conscience, but I think the existence of the certainty in a party structure in itself isn't problematic for that.
I know we're over time with that, but I just think there was a really interesting point that you made, and that's one thing about why I really love councils, is because every vote is essentially a conscience vote. The counter to that, though, is why I don't tend to lean in favour of increasing the size of councils, is because you inherently get to the position where no one knows what anyone stands for, and you have to be able to hold hands and then have some sort of pseudo-party system, which then undermines what initially attracted me to that role. So a lot of challenges. I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of you for having us here, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be amongst friends and hearing some intellectually stimulating conversation. It's been fantastic.
Gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Appreciate
and
it,
to you all.
Cheers.
We're now going to break for half an hour. Please take the chance to have some refreshments and enjoy the company of good friends. Community is such an important part when it comes to courage. So chat amongst yourselves and find someone you didn't come with.
Thank you, sir.